February 1st, 1943. Over the docks at Tunis, North Africa, a German Messerschmitt 109 sliced clean through the tail of an American B-17 bomber. Not a glancing blow, mind you. The fighter's wing cut through that fuselage like a guillotine, severing the tail section so completely that it hung by nothing more than a few spars and a thin strip of aluminum skin. The tail gunner, Sam Sarpelis, found himself trapped alone in that dangling section, 22,000 feet above enemy territory, with nothing but open sky and certain death waiting below. And somehow, that bomber flew home. That's what we're here to talk about today. Not just one story, but hundreds of them. Stories that sound impossible, stories that shouldn't have endings where men walked away alive. Stories about a four-engine heavy bomber that by all rights should have fallen from the sky 1,000 times over, but didn't. The Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress. They called it the plane that could fly home half destroyed. And before we're done here, you'll understand that wasn't marketing, that wasn't propaganda, that was just the truth. Now, let me take you back to where it all began. Because understanding what made these bombers so legendary means understanding what they were built to do, and more importantly, what they had to survive to do it. The late 1930s, Europe sliding toward war again. Everybody can feel it coming. And the United States Air Corps, they're looking for something new. They don't want another light bomber, another attack plane. No, they want something that can hit deep into enemy territory, something that can carry enough bombs to matter, and something that can fight its way there and back without fighter escort. A fortress of the air, if you will. Boeing steps up with their Model 299 prototype. July 28, 1935, the thing lifts off from Seattle Field in Seattle, and right there at that moment, watching it climb with its four engines and that unmistakable silhouette, a reporter from the Seattle Times, Richard Williams, he mutters something that sticks. Why, it's a flying fortress. Boeing trademarked that name faster than you can imagine. Now here's the thing about the early B-17s, the ones that came before the war really started heating up. They weren't perfect, far from it. The B-17 C and D models, they had their issues. Not enough armor, not enough guns, engines that couldn't quite deliver the power they needed at altitude. But Boeing kept working, kept refining, and by the time the B-17E rolled out in September 1941, they'd fixed most of those problems. Bigger tail, more defensive armament, better turrets. And then came the F model and then the G, each one tougher, each one deadlier. But let's be clear about something. None of that, none of those improvements prepared anyone for what these bombers would actually have to endure once the shooting started for real. December 7th, 1941, Pearl Harbor. While Japanese planes are tearing through Battleship Row, 12 B-17s from the 38th and 88th Reconnaissance Squadrons are flying in from California, coming in to reinforce the Philippines. They're unarmed, low on fuel, and they fly straight into the middle of the attack. Leonard Smith Humiston, he was the co-pilot on one of those fortresses. Years later, he'd tell the story of how he thought the Navy was giving them a 21-gun salute celebrating their arrival. Took him a few seconds to realize those were Japanese fighters shooting at them, that Pearl Harbor was burning below them, that they were landing in the middle of a war that had just started. His B-17 got diverted to Bellows Field, overran the runway, ended up in a ditch. Then the Japanese strafed it on the ground, more than 200 bullet holes. But here's the thing. The crew walked away, every single one of them. That should have been the first sign. This airplane, it could take punishment that would have torn other bombers apart. Now, by 1942, by 43, the 8th Air Force is setting up shop in England, and they've got a mission: daylight precision bombing. The RAF, the British, they're bombing at night, hitting area targets, trying to break German morale by leveling cities. The Americans want to be more surgical about it. Factories, rail yards, oil refineries, ball bearing plants, Hit the things that keep the German war machine running, hit them in daylight when you can see what you're aiming at. Sounds good on paper, doesn't it? Problem is, daylight bombing means the German fighters can see you too, and the flak gunners, they get a clear shot. And you're flying straight and level on your bomb run, can't maneuver, can't take evasive action, just sitting there while everything below you tries to knock you out of the sky. The 8th Air Force learned real quick that this wasn't going to be easy. Early missions, they're losing bombers at rates that couldn't be sustained. 20% losses on some raids, 30%. The crews were doing the math, realizing that statistically they wouldn't survive their 25-mission tour. The Pentagon set that 25-mission mark as the threshold. Complete 25 and you go home. But in those early months, hardly anybody was making it. The bomber crews, these were boys mostly, 19, 20, 21 years old, and they knew the odds. They knew what happened to the crews that didn't come back. But they climbed into those B-17s anyway, morning after morning, and they flew. Let me tell you what it was like up there. A B-17 cruises at 27,000 feet, sometimes higher. At that altitude, the air temperature is 60 below zero, sometimes colder. The crews wore heated flight suits, heated boots, but it still wasn't enough sometimes. Frostbite was common. Your breath would freeze on your oxygen mask. The guns, the machine guns defending the bomber, they'd freeze up too if you didn't keep firing them to generate heat. 10 men crewed a B-17. Pilot, co-pilot up front. Bombardier and navigator in the nose. Radio operator, flight engineer manning the top turret. Ball turret gunner hanging in that little sphere under the belly of the plane. 2 waist gunners on either side. Tail gunner in the back, the loneliest position on the aircraft, isolated from everyone else, watching for fighters coming up from behind. They'd fly in formation, tight formations called combat boxes, designed so that each bomber could cover the others with its machine guns. The theory was that a well-flown formation could defend itself, that the overlapping fields of fire from all those 50 caliber machine guns would keep the German fighters at bay. Theory didn't always work out in practice. The German fighter pilots, they figured out real quick that head-on attacks were the way to go. The early B-17s didn't have much firepower pointing forward, so the fighters would come screaming in from 12 o'clock high, guns blazing, and peel off at the last second. Sometimes they didn't peel off in time. Mid-air collisions happen more than you'd think. And then there was the flak, anti-aircraft fire. You'd be flying along, everything's fine, and then suddenly the sky around you erupts in black puffs of smoke, shrapnel tearing through aluminum like it was paper. You couldn't dodge it, couldn't really do anything about it except fly through it and hope. The sound of shrapnel hitting your airplane, it's like somebody throwing gravel against a tin roof, except some of that gravel is the size of your fist and moving fast enough to punch clean through anything in its path. Engines would get hit and catch fire, fuel tanks would rupture, hydraulic lines would get severed, wings would get holed so badly you could see daylight through them, and the B-17s kept flying. August 17th, 1943, the Schweinfurt-Regensburg mission. This one was ambitious. 2 forces of B-17s, 376 bombers total, hitting German fighter production facilities deep in enemy territory, deeper than they'd ever gone before. The escorts, the P-47 Thunderbolts, they could only go so far before they had to turn back, didn't have the range to make it all the way to the target and back. So the bombers went on alone. The Luftwaffe was waiting. Hundreds of German fighters, and they hit those formations with everything they had. Wave after wave of attacks, from the moment the American escorts turned back until the bombers were almost home again. The running battle lasted hours, and when it was over, 60 B-17s didn't come back. 60. That's 600 men, most of them dead or captured. But the survivors, they'd hit their targets. And more importantly, they'd proven that the B-17 could take the kind of beating that would have brought down any other bomber. One fortress from that mission, tail number 41-24406, all American. That's the one I mentioned at the start, the one that got hit by the Messerschmitt over Tunis. Let me tell you more about that, because it's worth hearing in full. Lieutenant Kendrick Bragg was piloting All-American that day over North Africa. His formation had just bombed the docks at Tunis and was heading back to base at Biskra, Algeria. The German fighters came up to harass them, and one of those Messerschmitts, either the pilot was hit or he was trying a ramming attack, nobody knows for sure, but that fighter came in and didn't pull up in time. The Messerschmitt's wing hit the B-17's tail section and disintegrated, broke apart, but it took most of the B-17's tail with it. The left stabilizer, gone. The rudder, mangled. The fuselage, cut almost completely through. You could look through that bomber and see blue sky on the other side. Sam Sarpolis, the tail gunner, he was trapped back there in that severed section. The intercom still worked barely, so he could talk to the rest of the crew, but there was no way for them to reach him. He was alone, hanging on while the wind screamed through the wreckage, while that tail section swayed and flexed with every movement of the airplane. Lieutenant Bragg, he told his crew they had a choice. They could bail out over enemy territory, become prisoners of war if they survived the jump, or they could stay with the airplane and try to fly it home. One by one, the crew decided to stay, all of them, including Sarpolis in the back, trapped and alone, but refusing to abandon ship. They flew like that for over an hour and a half. The bomber shouldn't have been able to fly at all, not with that much damage. The aerodynamics were all wrong. Boeing engineers would later say that by every calculation, that airplane should have broken apart or spun out of control within minutes. But it didn't. They made it back to Biskra. Bragg put that fortress down on the runway, held the tail off the ground as long as he could, and when it finally came down, dragging in the dirt, the bomber rolled to a stop. Every single member of that crew walked away alive. When they got Sarpolis out of that tail section, he was shaken but uninjured. The photographs of All-American sitting on that runway in Algeria with its tail hanging by threads, those photos became some of the most famous images of the war. And that bomber, after they patched it up, it flew combat missions again. Think about that. They repaired it and sent it back into battle. That kind of durability, that ability to absorb catastrophic damage and keep flying, that wasn't unique to All-American. It was just the most dramatic example of something that happened over and over again with B-17s. There was the Fortress from the 91st Bomb Group. Took a direct flak hit that blew a hole in the fuselage so big you could drive a car through it. The top turret gunner got blown right out of the airplane, but the pilots wrestled it back to England and landed it safely. The rest of the crew made it home. There was Little Miss Mischief, came back from a raid so shot up that the ground crew counted over 1,000 holes. 1,000! Looked like somebody had used it for target practice. But it was still flying, engines still running, and it landed without incident. Bomber after bomber, mission after mission, they limp home with one engine out, sometimes two. They'd come back with hydraulics shot out, landing gear jammed, control surfaces barely responding. They'd come back with dead crewmen still aboard, with wounded bleeding in the waist, with fires that the crew managed to put out before they consumed the whole airplane. And the thing is, the pilots, they trusted that airplane. They trusted it in a way you can't quite explain unless you've been there. They knew the B-17 would keep fighting to get them home, would keep flying even when it shouldn't be able to. And that trust meant everything when you were 6 miles up and 1,000 miles from friendly territory. October 14th, 1943. Black Thursday. The second raid on Schweinfurt. This one was even worse than the first. 291 B-17s took off that morning from bases all across England. Their target, the ball bearing factories in Schweinfurt, Germany. Ball bearings, those little steel spheres that let machinery turn smoothly, they were vital to the German war effort. Aircraft engines, tank engines, every piece of mechanical equipment needed them. Take out the factories, the thinking went, and you'd cripple German production across the board. The problem was, Schweinfurt was deep in Germany. The escorts could only go so far, and once they turned back, the bombers were on their own for hours. Hours of flying through flak and fighters, hours of exposure to everything the Germans could throw at them. It was a bloodbath. The German fighters hit the formations before they even reached the target. They'd perfected their tactics by then, knew exactly where the B-17s were most vulnerable. They came in from the front, from the sides, from above and below, sometimes 8 or 10 at a time. They fired rockets from outside the range of the bombers' guns, big 21-centimeter rockets that could blow a B-17 out of the sky with one hit. The flak over Schweinfurt was the heaviest anybody had seen. The sky turned black with it, a solid wall of explosions that the bombers had to fly through. No way around it, just straight ahead into that maelstrom of steel and fire. 600 men didn't come home that day. Some of them were killed in the air, died when their bombers exploded or when they got hit by flak or bullets. Some of them, they bailed out and got captured, spent the rest of the war in POW camps. Some of them, their bodies were never found. The 305th Bomb Group lost 13 bombers. 13 out of the group that took off that morning. That's 130 men gone. And the ground crews at Chelveston, their base, they waited for those planes to come back. They watched 3 land, then 4, and then nothing. Just silence. 13 crews that weren't coming home. The losses were so bad that the 8th Air Force had to call a halt to deep penetration missions. They admitted, officially, that they'd lost air superiority over Germany. The bombers couldn't keep going in without long-range fighter escort, and the escorts didn't exist yet. The P-51 Mustang was being developed, but it wasn't ready. So they stopped, pulled back, and waited. Black Thursday taught the 8th Air Force a lot of lessons, most of them written in blood. But here's the thing about those 60 bombers that went down. What about the 231 that made it back? What about the ones that took hits and kept flying, that limped home on 2 engines or 1, that landed with half their crew dead or wounded, but the pilots still in control? Those bombers survived because they were B-17s. Another design, another airplane, and those losses would have been even higher. Let me tell you about a different kind of survival story. December 20th, 1943. A B-17F named Olde Pub, piloted by 2nd Lieutenant Charlie Brown. This was Brown's first mission as an aircraft commander, and the target was Bremen, Germany, the Focke-Wulf factory, heavily defended. The mission went bad from the start. Heavy flak over the target knocked out 1 engine, damaged another. The bomber fell behind the formation, and when you fell behind, you were dead. The stragglers, that's what the German fighters hunted. They came after Olde Pub like wolves after a wounded deer. 15 fighters, attacking in waves. The bomber's nose got shot out, the plexiglass just gone. The radio operator got killed, the bald turret gunner got wounded. The oxygen system failed, and Brown passed out from hypoxia. Woke up to find his airplane diving toward the ground in an uncontrolled descent. He pulled out of that dive at about 1,000 feet, so low he almost hit the rooftops. The B-17 was in tatters, controls barely working, most of the guns shot out, wounded men bleeding everywhere. But it was still flying, so Brown turned it west and started flying toward England. They flew over a German airfield, right over it, low enough that people on the ground could see the damage, could count the holes in that bomber. And one of those people was a Luftwaffe fighter pilot named Franz Stigler. Stigler had already shot down 2 B-17s that day. One more kill would earn him the Knight's Cross, one of the highest awards Germany could give. So he jumped in his Messerschmitt 109 and took off after this crippled American bomber. He pulled up alongside Olde Pub, close enough to see into the wreckage, close enough to see the wounded crew trying to help each other. And something in Stigler, he couldn't do it. He couldn't shoot at men who were already beaten, men who were half dead and just trying to get home. His old commander in North Africa had told him once, If I ever see you shoot at a man in a parachute, I'll shoot you myself." To Stigler, looking at that shattered bomber, it was the same thing. Those men were as helpless as if they'd bailed out. So he didn't shoot. Instead, he flew alongside Brown's bomber, escorted it toward the coast. He flew close enough that the German flak guns wouldn't fire, because they'd risk hitting him too. He stayed with the Olde Pub until they were over the North Sea, over open water, and then he saluted, peeled off, and flew back to Germany. Brown kept flying, 250 miles across the North Sea, barely maintaining altitude, that bomber on the edge of falling apart the whole way. He made it to England, landed at a base near Norwich, and his crew, most of them, survived. The tail gunner was dead, but the rest made it. Brown wanted to tell people about the German pilot who'd let him live, but the Air Force classified the whole incident. Couldn't have stories about chivalrous German pilots getting out. Might make people think the enemy was human. So Brown kept quiet for decades, kept the story to himself. 45 years later, in 1990, he finally tracked Stigler down, found him living in Canada. They became friends, close friends, stayed in touch until they both died in 2008, 8 months apart. Two old warriors who'd shared a moment of humanity in the middle of the most inhuman conflict in history. But here's what I want you to understand about that story. The Olde Pub made it home because it was a B-17. Any other bomber with that much damage would have gone down. But Brown flew it across the North Sea, landed it in one piece, and most of his crew survived to go home. That's what the B-17 did. It kept men alive. Now, you might be wondering, what made it so tough? What was it about the B-17's design that let it take that kind of punishment? Part of it was redundancy. 4 engines meant you could lose 1, even 2, and still fly. The flight controls had multiple redundant systems. The fuel tanks were self-sealing. They'd close up around bullet holes so you didn't lose all your fuel. The structure itself, the airframe, it was built heavy. Boeing overbuilt everything, made it stronger than it probably needed to be, and that extra strength saved lives when the shooting started. Part of it was the wing design. That big, broad wing gave the B-17 lift to spare. You could lose sections of it, blow holes in it, and the airplane would still generate enough lift to stay aloft. Pilots talked about how stable the B-17 was, how forgiving. It didn't want to fall out of the sky. It would fight to stay up, even when it was mortally wounded. And part of it, honestly, was just good engineering. Boeing built a hell of an airplane. They built it to specifications that called for high-altitude bombing, long-range missions, defensive armament. But they built it tougher than the specifications required. They built it like they knew it would have to survive things nobody could plan for. The ground crews, the mechanics who maintained these bombers, they loved the B-17. Easy to work on, parts were accessible, and it was forgiving of maintenance mistakes, too. A bomber that came back shot to hell, they could patch it up, get it flying again, sometimes in just a day or two. They replaced engines, replaced whole sections of wing, replaced tails, and the bomber would fly again like nothing had happened. Compare that to the B-24 Liberator, the other American heavy bomber. The B-24 could carry more bombs, could fly faster, had longer range. On paper, it was the better airplane. But the crews preferred the B-17. When you ask them why, they tell you the B-17 felt safer. It felt like it would bring you home. And the statistics back that up. B-17s had better survival rates than B-24s. Not by a huge margin, but enough that it mattered, enough that crews noticed. Let me tell you about the Memphis Belle. You've probably heard of it. There was a movie back in 1990, but the real story's even better. The Memphis Belle was a B-17F, serial number 4124485, assigned to the 91st Bombardment Group. Her pilot was Captain Robert Morgan, and he named the bomber after his girlfriend back home, Margaret Polk, who lived in Memphis, Tennessee. The nose art was one of those petty girl pinups, you know the style, and it became one of the most recognizable images of the war. The Belle flew her first mission November 7, 1942, submarine pens at Brest, France. Between then and May 17, 1943, she flew 25 combat missions, and that was the magic number. 25 missions meant you'd completed your tour, you could go home. Now, the Belle wasn't actually the first B-17 to complete 25 missions. That honor goes to a bomber called Hell's Angels from the 303rd Bomb Group, flew its 25th mission on May 13th, 4 days before the Belle. But the Belle's crew was the first to finish 25 missions and go home together as a complete crew. And more importantly, there was a filmmaker documenting the Belle's missions, a director named William Wyler, and he was making a movie about the strategic bombing campaign. So the Memphis Belle became the poster child for the 8th Air Force. They flew her back to the States in June '43, took the crew on a war bond tour, 31 cities across America. People turned out in droves to see that bomber, to meet the crew, to hear their stories. It was good for morale, good for recruiting, good for selling war bonds. But here's what made the Memphis Belle legendary. It wasn't just that she completed 25 missions, it's what she went through to get there. The ground crew chief, Joe Giambrone, he kept track of every repair. By the time the Belle finished her 25th mission, they'd replaced 9 engines on her. 9! They'd replaced both wings, replaced 2 tails, replaced both main landing gear assemblies. That bomber had been rebuilt piecemeal, one shot-up component at a time, and she kept flying. 25 missions. She'd been hit by flak more times than anybody could count. German fighters had shot her up, put thousands of holes in her. She'd brought her crew home every single time, and most importantly, every member of that crew survived the war. After the war, the Memphis Belle almost got scrapped. Ended up in a boneyard in Oklahoma, sitting outside, weathering away. The mayor of Memphis, Walter Chandler, he bought her for $350 and brought her back to Memphis in 1946. She sat on display there for decades, deteriorating, until finally the Air Force took her back and restored her properly. Today, she's at the National Museum of the United States Air Force at Wright-Patterson, fully restored, looking like she did in 1943. You can go see her if you want. Stand there and look at her and think about what she did, what she survived, what she meant to the men who flew her. The B-17 dropped more bombs on Germany than any other American aircraft. Over 640,000 tons of bombs, compared to 452,000 tons from the more numerous B-24s. Part of that's because the 8th Air Force preferred the B-17, kept using it even when the B-24 was supposed to be the replacement. The crews trusted it more, the maintenance was easier, and when you're flying into hell every other day, trust matters more than performance specs. Between 1935 and 1945, Boeing and their subcontractors built 12,731 B-17s. By the end of the war, 4,735 of them had been lost in combat. That's a 37% loss rate. More than a third of all the B-17s ever built got shot down or crashed or were destroyed in accidents. That's a staggering number when you think about it. Each one of those lost bombers meant 10 men dead or captured or wounded. But think about the flip side of that statistic. 63% of B-17s survived. More than half the bombers built made it through the war intact. Given what they were flying into, given the defenses they faced, that's remarkable. Less than 50 B-17s survive today in complete form. 45 to be precise, scattered across museums and private collections around the world. A handful of them can still fly, though they don't fly often anymore. These are 80-year-old airplanes, maintained by dedicated volunteers and enthusiasts, kept in the air as flying museums, living history. If you ever get a chance to see one fly, to hear those 4 Wright Cyclone engines rumbling, to watch that big bomber lumber down the runway and lift into the sky, take that chance, because there's not going to be many more opportunities. The airframes are getting old, parts are getting harder to find, And one by one, these survivors are being retired to permanent museum display. But as long as even one of them can still fly, as long as we can still hear those engines and see that silhouette against the sky, the legacy of the B-17 stays alive. And let me tell you what that legacy is. It's not about the bombs dropped or the targets destroyed. Those are just statistics, numbers in a report. The real legacy of the B-17 is the men it brought home. The pilots who trusted it to keep flying when every instinct said they should bail out. The gunners who stayed at their posts while flak burst around them, knowing their bomber would hold together. The wounded crewmen who survived because the B-17 stayed in the air long enough to get them to a hospital. Every time a B-17 limped back to England with one engine out and half its crew wounded, that was the legacy. Every time a pilot put one down safely after a mission that should have killed them all, that was the legacy. Every family that got their son back instead of a telegram from the War Department, that was the legacy. The B-17 wasn't perfect, it wasn't invincible. Plenty of them went down, plenty of crews didn't make it home. But compared to what might have been, compared to the losses if they'd been flying a less capable airplane, the B-17 saved thousands of lives. There's a quote from one of the pilots. I forget who said it first, but it sums up how the crews felt about their airplane. He said, "The B-17 wasn't built to fly. It was built to bring us home." And that's exactly what it did. Think about All American with its tail hanging by threads. Think about Ye Olde Pub shot to pieces and still flying across the North Sea. Think about the Memphis Belle and those 9 replaced engines. Think about all the bombers that came home on 2 engines, 1 engine, no hydraulics, half a wing blown away, on fire, full of holes, but still flying. The B-17 Flying Fortress earned its name 100 times over. It was a fortress not because it was impervious to damage, but because it could take that damage and not break. It was a fortress because the men inside it could trust it, could depend on it, could know that even when everything went wrong, their airplane would fight to get them home. That's what made it legendary. Not its bomb load, or its speed, or its service ceiling. Its toughness, its refusal to quit, its stubborn determination to keep flying no matter what got thrown at it. They don't make them like that anymore. Can't really. Modern military aircraft are built for different specifications, designed for different missions. But every once in a while, at an air show or a museum, you'll see one of those surviving fortresses, and if you're lucky, you'll see it fly. And when you do, take a moment. Think about what that airplane represents. It represents the young men who climbed aboard mission after mission, knowing the odds, but going anyway. It represents the ground crews who worked through the night to patch up damage and get the bombers ready for the next day's mission. It represents American industrial might, Boeing's engineers and factory workers building the toughest bomber anybody had ever seen. But most of all, it represents survival, the will to live, the refusal to give up, the determination to make it home no matter what. That's the story of the B-17 Flying Fortress, the plane that could fly home half destroyed. And now you know why.